Welcome to That's
That's
High
high
Praise,
praise.
a Nicolas Cage podcast.
I'm your co-host VH
And
Zest.
I'm your other co-host, Captain Nostalgia. What is going on, my good dude?
Yo, yo. So it is a new month. It's a new week here at the time of recording. Uh, but it is not a new movie. We have just watched the 1998 thriller Snake Eyes, starring the one and only Nicolas Cage.
This cast actually is really,
Oh, it's amazing.
it's a really well put together cast.
Yeah.
Gary Sinise in this, Carla Gugino, who is like been my
My
celebrity.
childhood crush.
Yeah, dude, same. Like
Dude, oh my
son,
gosh.
son-in-law, and she just never left. Yeah,
Spy Kids, but all right.
yes, Spy Kids too. Kevin Dunn, uh, Luis Guzman. Like, I mean, just this cast is great, but also it's like
Yeah.
it's also the people behind the scenes as well. Like David Knapp, who wrote this movie, also wrote the first Spider-Man movie, among various other films as well, including Jurassic Park, First Mission Impossible. He's writing Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny at the end of this month. He wrote the 2017 The Mummy. He's done so much, but then you also have Brian De Palma, this juggernaut who's also done so many freaking films.
Including like the aforementioned Mission Impossible.
Mhm. Yeah, he's also done The Untouchables. He obviously also jumped into the world of horror with Carrie back in the late 70s. And like Scarface also happened to
Huge movie.
do like a bunch of like erotic thrillers in the 80s and 90s, including Dress to Kill, Body Double. I mean, there's so much talent involved in this movie. And so I think this is going to be an interesting episode. There's not a whole lot of mental health themes, so I'll say that at the front that this is probably not going to be a mental health heavy episode.
Yeah, really in general, the movie is fairly one-dimensional. Which I think the aim was very the opposite, but it ends up being fairly one-dimensional.
I want to say that I feel like this movie is before I share general thoughts, was it the first time for you?
It was. Yeah, I
Hmm.
had never seen this before. I owned it on tape for quite some time, just waiting for this inevitable episode, holding on to a few movies like that. Um, and I don't know if you do that, Josh. Like, do you spare yourself the first time watch for a Nicolas Cage movie for the episode, or will you watch it beforehand and then rewatch it for an episode?
If I really want to see a movie for Nicolas Cage's career, then I will jump into it.
Mhm.
But if I buy like I do the same thing where like I buy like The Family Man's a great example. That has been sitting on my shelf collection
Same.
wise for like a year and a half, maybe even 2 years. And I will
Yep.
purchase like DVDs, Blu-rays. I will get stuff if they're like on sale. And because I know eventually like we'll be doing an episode on it. So it depends on
Yep.
the movie. It honestly
Sure.
depends on the movie.
Sure. That makes sense. Yeah. But it was though, I think for both of us in this case, like we're elaborating on first time watch. And I'm gonna go ahead and do first thoughts,
Hmm,
Josh.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
so this movie is um it is a thriller and it really drives that point home hard and fast. It really, really does. Uh um yeah, so basically the idea is there's Nicolas Cage plays this cop who's not dirty necessarily, but he's a two-timer, he's into gambling. So you get the idea that he's just kind of a free man in every sense of the words, but he's not necessarily a bad cop. Um, and he is just charisma, out the wazoo. Just really showing his colors, excited at a heavyweights boxing match. And one thing leads to another, which is really the whole plot of the movie. Someone gets shot. And it was actually the Secretary of Defense gets shot. Um, And that's kind of where the movie takes us from there. And there's a couple of characters that start off as big question marks, namely a couple of females that just come out of nowhere um, early on. And uh, yeah, so it's kind of like I think the movie wants to be sort of a mystery thriller. I don't think the mystery aspect is that effective personally, but it is an effective thriller at the very least.
I You mentioned earlier about this being a one-dimensional thriller, and I think in some respects you're right. I think this film is really top heavy to where the first two acts of this are really solid. There's a lot of great action. It paces itself really well. There's a lot of really well done red herrings.
Yeah.
And I had actually this is one of the very few Cage movies I had seen prior to recording
Okay.
this. And I remember like in my mind, I remembered like just this movie just being kind of mediocre. And as I'm watching the first two acts, I was like, I don't remember why I thought this movie was meh. Maybe I was just in kind of like a bland headspace. And
Wow.
then like
That was me all day.
the reveal of like the whole like Nicolas Cage, Gary Sinise that we'll talk about, like whole reveal there I just felt like the movie like it just goes off the rails from there. That's where the movie loses me because I feel
Yeah.
like it tries to be this really like I don't want to say like intelligent, but it has a good way of like I think the multiple like perspectives of how everything's told. Like I think
Hmm.
they do a really good job, but once it kind of just goes away from that formula, that's really where it just is like, we're
Yeah,
done here.
I agree wholeheartedly to the point where I felt the same. Like I watched the movie and I was just like, am I was I just not in the mood for a movie? Like what am I just like what's up? Because that was a very well put together movie, but I am like by the end, at least by the end, definitely the third act, I was just like I am just dissatisfied. And that's just ultimately like how I felt. And um yeah, but it's cast very well. It's not written altogether poorly. Certainly the dialogue is very strong. The cinematography is its strongest feature by far. Like multiple lengthy one shots, single shot, like panorama kind of deal. Over the hotel room shots from one hotel room into another, nonstop action, just one continuous shot. Really cool stuff like that. Um, but yeah, it was like they try to do this and they succeed. They do this kind of multiple perspective, go back into the timeline of the night, show this person's perspective of who got shot and when. Oh, the shooter got shot by this guy and that kind of thing. Um, and that all is very effective. But then once it gets into the third act, it just sort of it just sort of loses its luster.
Well,
I don't know how else to say it.
so a couple things to unpack there. First off, I am really upset that the outfit that Nicolas Cage wears in the beginning of this movie, where he's got like the floral shirt and then like the blue blazer and like pants, I am so upset that he does not wear that throughout the entire film. Like,
Honestly,
imagine a cop like coming up like a detective like Rick coming up and like taking a matter this seriously and he's wearing that. Like that would
yeah,
have made the movie, I feel like it would have been it would have worked with the tone too. Like
yeah,
this was the 90s. You literally could have done anything and it would have
right,
worked. And
yeah,
that's the genius thing about that era of filmmaking.
yeah. And to the credit of this movie too, like you pointed out, like this is the 90s. I will say this movie has aged actually pretty well. It doesn't feel out of
Mhm.
date. The story doesn't feel out of date. Even the technology doesn't really feel out of date. Here we are 25 years after this film. That kind of aspect of storytelling, really effective, really worked out well in the long run. Um, but yeah, you're right. Like uh Nicolas Cage's wardrobe is just I think it's kind of almost akin to like what I'm pretty sure he wore in like Wild at Heart, which was I think like a snakeskin blazer kind of.
Yeah.
It was like it was a similar vibe. Um, and like that was all really really fun. And um, Cage does Cage does an incredible job, and of course we tend to say that anyway. But really, like I feel like before this movie, I had never seen him quite with the kind of charisma that he possesses early on in this film.
Yes.
He's often loud and boisterous in his films, and he's often like down to earth and happy. This was the first time I've ever seen him do both beautifully. Like he's just an ecstatic, like exuberant personality, genuinely excited about everyone and everything happening around him. It's so well executed. It's like you get sort of the Nicolas Cage isms, but with a different spin.
Yeah, I think Cage in this movie is really great. I think he chose that line between his like signature mannerisms, like you mentioned, and charisma really well.
Mhm,
You could tell that he's very passionate
mhm.
about the vices that he picks. And I I really think that this movie missed maybe this is just me fishing because we talk about mental health
Sure.
alongside of Nicolas Cage. But one of the things that we've never been able to in all the podcasts that we've ever produced for Victims and Villains, we've never been able to talk about gambling addiction aside from like a random Simpsons episode. And gambling
Yeah.
addiction is something that's like very, very severe. And I honestly thought that I really wish that they would have like addressed a little bit more with like of his like history with like some of the booking agents and
Yeah.
like some of the guys
Yeah.
because like you said, like this movie just feels really like one dimensional, but
Mhm.
that's a lot of like these blockbusters that were made in the 90s. They were
Yeah.
very like just there was not a whole lot of depth to them, and that's fine.
Yeah.
These are popcorn movies. I don't think every
Right.
Nicolas Cage movie that we are going to talk about on this podcast is going to warrant really deep philosophical themes and mental health themes the way that movies
Sure.
like Pig or Adaptation have done.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true. I think that something am fond of the 90s and early 2000s for. I'm not a big action movie fan anymore, but back in the 90s and early 2000s, action was almost synonymous with comedy.
Hmm.
And that's something that I think the 90s and early 2000s, like I said, just did beautifully. And I almost think that like maybe that's what this movie is missing. It's missing sort of that pairing. It's the reason why Bad Boys and Rush Hour and stuff like that have maintained, popularity. They were good then. They hold up fairly well now. Maybe some of the jokes aside, is because they have that kind of. It's almost like the straight man, funny man of genres. It's just that action comedy um, genre duo just plays out really well. And this movie, I feel like, had that potential in Act One with some of Nicolas Cage's choices and mannerisms with the character. They just did really nothing with it. And Luis Guzman too. Luis Guzman's a funny dude, and just did really nothing with it.
Yeah, I don't think that this movie necessarily needed comedy. I would argue that if anything, this movie was in some ways actually ahead of its time. The fact that this movie revolves around an armed gunman shooting up a packed house
Yeah,
uh, in
that's true.
a sports arena, that's not something that we were talking about in the 90s.
Yeah,
When Columbine happened in 1999, it was kind of really the first time that we had experienced and it felt like it had talked openly about it, at least in our generation.
yeah,
And nowadays it feels like it's a constant conversation that we're having, unfortunately. But
yeah,
this was a movie that was doing it 25 years before, events like the Aurora, that Dark Knight Returns shooting in 2012, the Sandy Hook shooting, a lot of the school shootings that we're seeing now, like so, and even the fears around like Joaquin Phoenix's Joker. A lot of people thought
yeah,
that there were going to be like shootings in movie theaters happening, but this movie
yeah,
kind of predated that stuff. And I think right now in with 2023 lens, it's a I mean, it's still a very real fear.
Yeah.
here now, and it feels kind of like almost this like out of body experience to be talking about a movie that had was having this conversation 25 years ago.
Yeah, right, right. I think so. It ends up that the shooting is very, it has sort of like a military political sort of bias toward it. That's why there was a shooting. It wasn't
Well,
it wasn't a madman. It was calculated. It was a team effort.
so
But nevertheless, go ahead.
let me ask you that. Like, did that
Yeah,
lose you a little bit when they kind of started getting into like the political like agendas of like the group that Gary Sinise like led?
yeah, it did, especially later on in the movie. Like in the first act, because everything happens quick. Movie gets right to it, and I really enjoy that. Um, because especially since it's really not that long of a movie. Um, so they get right to it, and when there is this sort of like um conspiracy, and Cage calls it that, like five people involved, that's conspiracy. I don't know why that feels a little arbitrary to me, but I'm on board. Um, so there's five people that are apparently involved, or that they are hypothesizing are involved in this thing, and that had me. I was very very interested in that. And then the fact that it was a Secretary of Defense, also very very interesting, because it just made sense, I guess. Um, but when they got into the reasons why, yeah, it went really really over my head. It had to do with like, basically the military. Some people in the military had been doing some training in Norfolk, where I grew up, um, with some sort of new like weapon, and they were trying to um, basically forge the success records of the test, when the test was actually not successful. And then there was a woman whose job it was to like, I think she was in military intelligence, to some degree, and her job was to like survey those kinds of things and like look over some paperwork. And I guess if I'm kind of spitballing here, because again, some of that did go over my head. Um, and she found out and tries to tell the Secretary of Defense that what was going on. And so this is kind of getting into spoiler territory.
Well, we could jump into it.
Yeah. So it so happens that they are actually trying to kill her, not the Secretary of Defense. And that twist, so to speak, wasn't really that big of a twist. Like
Mm-mm.
it makes sense. They explain it. Um, that I felt like they wanted it to make it. They wanted that to be more interesting, and it complicated things just a little bit and made it a little less interesting. At least I thought.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us. Yeah, so I have this problem with movies that are overly political. Like I don't necessarily have an issue with political movies in
Sure,
general, but if a
sure.
movie is attempting to over complicate its narrative by throwing in government and like espionage and just like all of these like other things, like that's where the point where you lose me. It's part of the reason that
Oh,
I'm not a huge fan of like later Transformers films is because like Michael Bay just overly complicated those narratives for no
yeah,
reason. And there's
yeah,
very little payoff. And so I feel like when you so as a film critic, as someone that runs a film festival, like the easiest way that I feel like you're going to sometimes the most simplest explanation is the most effective. And
totally.
I think the areas of this film really excels are the areas where it is a mystery. The first two-thirds of this movie are a mystery.
Hmm.
By the time that Gary Sinise has kind of been like revealed to be this like double crosser and really super shady guy, like and all this like explanation of like governments and satellites. Like I'm just like, dude, you 100% just took this like really simple concept of a whodunit, overcomplicated that motivation for quite literally no reason whatsoever.
Yeah,
It's like they try to explain it, but like no explanation ever feels like it justifies the complication that the
yeah.
writers go through.
Honestly, yeah. That's very, very much the case. Very, very much the case. Um, and there are some things that do kind of keep the movie going a little bit. Like once you find out like what the issue is with this girl, like you do generally want to see her like make it out alive and stuff because they're after her and things like that. And it is somewhat exciting that like, oh, um, you've been saying his name. What's the guy's name that you just said?
Gary Sinise?
Yes. So his character, like, and Cage's character are very, very close. And so when you find out that he is not the good guy in the situation, he's the antagonist of the film, that is kind of interesting and it gets vaguely emotional, but not really. But even then, like if you were paying attention, you would have known that within the first or early second act. Because there's one point where like there's a shooter behind a wall, and it's the guy who shot the Secretary of Defense. And um, what'd you say his name? Harry Sinise?
Gary
Yeah,
Sinise.
Gary Sinise. So yeah, his character is like next to that wall and he can't see what's behind it and he just shoots and kills the guy. And it's like he wasn't even paying attention to the shots as they were fired. He was paying attention to a girl and admits that. So the fact that he knows exactly where to shoot is just, they give it away. And I don't mind them giving away. I'm not a big fan of twists. I think like, making a story that cohesively makes sense is important. I don't mind them giving it away. But I do also think that like because maybe because they gave it away, the movie the story lacks impact later on.
No, no, he purposely shoots the gentleman in the booth that was set up to be the assassin. Because it's revealed later on in the movie that
But he's not even paying attention to
he's
the guy.
not. But that I would argue actually shows like just how skilled of a marksman he is. He might not, but there's a point in the film where he does 100% actually because it's shown from like a different angle. He willingly, knowingly shoots the guy getting in there, double crossing him, and then he stuffs the suicide note into his jacket pocket, and that's kind of where the big press reveal comes down later that it was a suicide mission, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, because they tried to, again, further politicizing it, they tried to make it sort of um a racial, I guess, thing, if you want to call it that. Um,
Also, just like switching off of here's your first trivia fact of the day. So, Gary Sinise in this movie plays Commander Kevin Dunn. This movie was actually originally written and offered to another actor. You have three guesses. Who else could you imagine in this role?
This is 1998, so Tom Cruise is my first choice.
Okay, you're not right.
Okay, rip. Um, uh, Will Smith is my second choice.
It was originally written for Will Smith.
Okay, cool.
And I'm interested to see how this movie would have been differently had Will Smith done a film like this because
Well, first of all, like Will Smith and Nicolas Cage, I mean, I would pay all kinds of money to see that.
same.
Just in general. And it makes me wonder, I know you were saying like the movie doesn't necessarily need comedy. I only brought comedy up because that was just what action movies were doing at the time. But it does raise that question of like, would this have been had a different take, maybe a more comedic take, had Will Smith been a part of it?
And you are just like just
What?
hung forward for this to be a comedy. I don't
My
know.
favorite action movies are action comedies.
I don't know necessarily that like it would have been more comedic had Will Smith done this because I mean he also did like Enemy of the State right around this
Yeah,
time.
you're right. Yeah.
And I mean he had really kind of like he would go on a few years after this to do Ali. Like he really like has proven himself to be a dramatic actor. And
Yeah.
I don't feel like we see enough roles where Will Smith is the bad guy. Like Deadshot is really the only one I can think of from Suicide Squad.
Hmm.
Because most of the guys that he's a lot like Cage, most of the guys that in his career, his filmography, most of the characters he goes after are the good guys.
Yeah. That was another thing I was going to bring up. Like, I truly, I want to see Nick Cage do bad guys more. I do. I will say that just from the get-go. However, I truly never tire of Nicolas Cage being the guy who will always do the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like the because it had been a few years since I'd seen this movie, and so like I always keep that in mind when I'm watching a Nick Cage movie to where I'm like, oh man, is he gonna play a bad guy? Because like I rewatched Renfield last week and like just forgot how good he was in that movie. And he's such a good creepy villain. Like he knows how to bring the intensity that's needed
Hmm.
for that role. But you don't see a him going after the bad guy role so often. And so when you first meet Rick, I'm like, all right, like is he a bad guy? Because like the scene where he beats up Luis Guzman in the out like in like that like little construction area, like I was like,
Yeah.
all right, cool, he's a bad guy. And then like the first act gets into the second act as we're like transitioning from this being a big fight to now this being a big mystery. And it's like,
Hmm.
oh no, he's actually the good guy
Yeah. Yeah.
with bad
In fact, I think
tendencies.
something I loved where the movie did get a little deeper is they kind of call back to that scene where um, he beats up Luis Guzman's character because Luis Guzman gives him a bunch of money and one of those bills has a bunch of blood on it.
Mm.
It's like sticky and red with blood. And uh, so the bad guy, Gary Sinise's character, later on when this is like early third act, they're really hashing it out. Nick Cage knows that like he's a double agent. He was involved in the conspiracy. Um, he offers Cage's character $1 million basically to stay quiet and turn over the girl. And like somehow or other, I think they had like he had roughed him up a little bit. Something happened where that dollar with blood on it had fell to the floor, and Cage's character like looks at it and refuses the deal because he realizes that like that would be blood money,
Yeah.
and like that's not something that he can continue with, like he can move forward with.
Yeah, it's like you do get like those like little pockets, but there's never enough for that depth to stay. Like
No,
it almost feels like a passing comment, like just going and like having a conversation with someone and going through like at a coffee shop and just being like, yeah, by the way, like I have a huge drug habit, like, or I'm an alcoholic. Like
yeah,
that's just how this movie kind of treats the heavier themes that it attempts to address.
Truly, it does, honestly, because I remember it was kind of funny and kind of awful. But like Gary Sinise's character, first act is asking Nicolas Cage. He's like, "How's Angela?" Like I think it was his wife's name. Like, "How's your wife?" And he's like, "Fat, fabulous. I love her." And then he's like, "How's your girlfriend?" And Cage is like, "Skinny, mean, needy. I love her." And it was just like, all right. And it's like it's kind of funny, it's kind of tongue in cheek, but they're trying to give you an idea of like just the kind of character this guy is, which is why like you're unsure in the first act whether he's gonna pan out to be a good guy or a bad guy. And then by the third act, they try to really like hammer it home that he's not quite a good guy. They don't do it very successfully or very well. But anyway, like you're right. To your point, it's just interesting how they make light of or are very passing about some of the more heavier topics in this movie. Very seldom in this film do they like actually take something for what it is.
Yeah, and that's kind of like it takes away from that real world experience because when you have a film like Snake Eyes that is addressing issues like war, terrorism,
Mhm,
gun violence, when it's addressing these really larger police corruption, uh,
mhm,
these larger, like really deep, profound themes that are very prevalent for us in 2023,
mhm.
it takes away from that groundedness and it almost kind of uh, gives this movie a little bit of like a fantastical edge to
Yeah,
where it's like it could be set in reality, but it's one of those like realities that would only pan out if you're like Steven Seagal or like
right.
Van Damme or like Schwarzenegger or like if you had like a Hollywood 80s kind of lifestyle.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Totally. And it really like I feel like a lot of movies nowadays um are really most of them are fictional to the point of being fantastic, if even mildly, right? But you do have like you're really pragmatic like movie fans who the content that they want to consume is realistic, and so they want like war movies for their action movies. They want, you know, dramas, for their commentative movies and things like that. They don't they're not interested in big IPs and stuff like that. Maybe a comedy every now and then, stuff based on true stories. But yeah, like I feel like at this point in time, and especially with this movie, it tries to take something that has legitimate potential and kind of go the opposite way with it, bringing it back more into that mainstream category of fantastic fiction.
Yeah. Well, so this is completely different direction. This is kind of random, but I really want to acknowledge some nostalgia here for me.
Sure.
I don't know. Did you grow up on Malcolm in the Middle by chance?
No, not really.
Okay. I wasn't sure where you were, but so I did. I loved that show growing up, and the gentleman that is in the casino that ends up picking out Carla Gugino's character, he's
Yeah,
from that.
actually, she picks him out.
Yeah, so he's from that show. That's David Anthony Higgins, and he is probably most famous. If you grew up on Malcolm, he played Greg Feldspar in that series. He was a regular on it. He also did Big Time Rush, but he's done a handful of like other like things. But I just, it's I always, anytime I get to see like an actor that I know from one thing and kind of get to see them do a completely different character, I always like
Yeah,
him. He was kind of one of my favorite parts of this movie. I think he kind of like
that's kind of funny.
I feel like this I feel like his character was supposed to be this like attempt at like comedic relief in this
Hmm.
kind of like heavier thematic movie.
Yeah,
Because there's that scene where like he's like obviously looking down her dress, looking at her chest, and then like he like gets her up to the uh gets her up to the hotel room and like he's prepared and then like she's in like a different thing. So you kind of have this like wacky exchange between him and Carla that happen. And um
Yeah,
I don't know. Like I think he's a great bit actor and at least from like the things that I've seen him in, and so I always like seeing him kind of turn up in random parts like Snake Eyes.
totally. Yeah, that's how I felt about I should have looked up his name before I started this. The guy played the dad in the first two Home Alone movies. Was in this as well. He was only I don't think he made it through the second act, but I thought that was like really random, and it was right around that time, so he still looked like he would have in the first two Home Alone movies. I thought that was really kind of fun and funny. Other than that, I don't really have any bouts of like, oh, I recognize this guy from whatever. I mean, I do recognize some people, obviously Carla from many things. But yeah, that was the one that like really caught me off guard was the one dude who played the dad in the first two Home Alone movies. I thought that was funny.
So here
Um,
here is another actor that we both know that is kind of like he's made a bit role, but Kevin Dunn in this movie. So there's the character Gary Sinise plays Commander Kevin Dunn, and the
mm,
actor Kevin Dunn who plays Lou
Kevin Dunn.
Logan in this movie. He is Sam Witwicky's dad from the first two Transformers. He was also the dad from Small Soldiers. Um,
Yeah.
but here's some trivia for you. So, according to the actor Kevin Dunn, the fact that Gary Sinise's character is also named Kevin Dunn caused confusion between the actors. According to Dunn, the actor, much to his surprise, he was given a penthouse suite in a fancy hotel to stay in during filming. The crew realized that they had accidentally given Sinise's suite to Dunn, and Dunn had to leave and stay at a hotel chain. Man,
Oh my gosh. Poor guy. Yeah, he looked vaguely familiar, and I don't know what else I've seen him in. Apparently, he made an appearance in WrestleMania some years back. He was, of course, in those Transformer movies. Um, I might know him first and foremost. Yeah, from Small Soldiers, Almost Heroes.
hmm
Um, yeah, that's pretty cool. That's kind of random. Godzilla, that the same year, 98. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, movie has like that's the cool thing. That's another cool thing about this movie is just like gems just in the cast. Like there are a lot of people that like they might not be like massive household names, but you have seen them, no questions asked.
Yeah, this is definitely a movie aside from like Carla and Cage and Sinise. This is a movie that is just full of character actors
Yeah.
that you're like, oh, I remember XYZ person from this movie from 1992 or this
Yeah,
television show that I grew up on. And
exactly.
I think this was a really cool experience to kind of like watch this and kind of like get to see what they could do in terms of um
Yeah.
big screen projects. But I know you're itching
Yeah.
for some more trivia.
I am.
So the opening 20 minutes Steadicam sequence is not actually one continuous shot. There are numerous hidden edits. At least 12 minutes of the sequence was done in one take, though, which is really
Wow.
impressive.
It is really impressive. And there are a couple scenes like that where it's just like they might not be, you know, 5+ minutes long, but they're a good, you know, one to four. And honestly, some of those are really, really cool given the amount of action you see within those single shots.
Yeah, this movie definitely utilizes that really well. And I think it
Hmm.
helps the intensity of um the intensity of the action throughout.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah, I actually I've never had this before watch like, with this podcast in particular, but this was the only movie that I really wished I was not watching on VHS because I felt like I was missing some of that like in your face kind of detail of some of those action sequences.
yeah, this would be a great movie to kind of get a chance to see on like a big screen or like to see like even streaming to kind
Yeah.
of be able to encapsulate
Yeah.
You are, you know, kind of being engrossed into that action.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it's on Tubi.
It is also on YouTube streaming for free as
Nice.
well. Um, but let me tell you some more trivia. All
Let's
right.
go.
So the original ending, which was a massive special effects sequence created by Industrial Light and Magic, involved a huge tidal wave going through the casino. The ending was cut in post-production. Numerous references to it still remain in the final film. A shot near the end of the film shows an ambulance driving down a waterside road with a wave about to crash into it before the scene cuts to another shot. Nicolas Cage's character talks about almost drowning at the very end of the film, and this is a reference to the storm that are made out through the entire film, which were all meant to build up to this action-packed climax that was cut out.
Interesting. I
I
wish they wouldn't have cut it out
no, like
at all.
it gives the storm and like the exterior shots outside of the arena like actual purpose.
Yeah, yeah, because like there's this there's this like newswoman you only see like two or three times, but she's like out in the rain, she's fighting it, she's complaining about the fact that she always gets these like stories. They keep talking about this hurricane or tropical storm, and it's irrelevant. It comes up multiple times and bears no relevance to the movie.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today. Yeah, it does feel like kind of purposeless, like to cut out a shot like that. And I've also never understand why studios will take big action sequences that are already filmed and then scrap them. Like that to me just
Yeah,
doesn't make any
it's a
sense
waste of money.
whatsoever. No, it is.
Yeah, waste of money. Yeah, but I also, if I can say this, like, um, the end was why I ended up not really loving this movie.
Same.
I was just like, because by the end, like Cage's character gets like indicted for something. I think it's cocaine. It comes out of
Okay,
nowhere
yeah.
and makes
Can
no
can
sense.
we talk about the weird like tabloid like presentation of Rick at the end of this movie
Yeah,
where it's like, all right, like you've gone through this like big ordeal. He's a hero. And I was like, you could have just ended it there. And then they're like, but wait, there's more. And it just
yeah,
kind of felt like they were consistently going and like trying to like pull for like the drama to be like, he
yeah,
got caught with cocaine or he got caught with a
yeah,
prostitute. I'm just
yeah,
like the fact that like there's like that scene at the very end where he's like coming out of his house and he's got like a gold Ferrari and he's got like tabloids coming up to him. I'm like, what is the purpose of this right here?
yeah. That doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't. It just doesn't. Yeah. I had something else to say, but yeah, it was just really super dissatisfying ending. Maybe they just did it because they wanted like that kiss scene between him and Carla at the end. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know that that was worth it. I think it may have more to do with kind of what you were getting into earlier about how like they were trying to politicize things, and like in the real world, it's very much a political move, or it's very much you see politics get that kind of exposure
Yeah.
frequently, and be that as it may, it was really a left field out in this movie.
Yeah, it felt so weird for this movie
Yeah.
to like do something like that. And like I I I feel like really just I think the thing that bothers me about the ending of this movie, knowing that like that was their original ending, like I feel like had you had it been something like The Rock, where it stayed all in one location and then they don't have to add on this epilogue afterwards, everything feels like such a smooth finale. Had that
Yeah.
climax with Gary Sinise come later in the movie and not at the beginning of the third act, I
Yeah.
feel like it would have been more responsive to
Yeah.
this.
Honestly, I've been watching a lot of movies recently, just in general, and I'll get to a movie, especially in like shorter, like 90-minute burns. You'll get to like the 70-minute mark, and that's including, the 90 minutes includes credits. You'll get to like the 70-minute mark, and they start the like resolution of the movie, or they haven't even started it yet. And I realize that like they do that so that there is more drama and action packed into that tail end of the movie, and it is a much more satisfying end. This movie, that little bit is portioned about 20 to 30 minutes too early,
Hmm.
and the tail end that they're left with is just kind of, it's like filler at the wrong end of the movie.
Yeah, like when you have that scene between like Gary and like Nick kind of like having their exchange and like Denise is like
Yeah,
giving his like grand plan, like I was like, I remember why I thought this movie was mid-tier now. Like
yeah,
this is the part where it just like it falls apart and it
yeah,
completely falls apart in the ending here. But I have some
yeah.
trivia about the ending if you would like it.
Please.
So at the 1 hour 29 minute mark, the mayor who represents the award at the end of this film is actually played by the real mayor of Atlantic City, Jim
Nice.
Whelan, who would have been at this time. I don't know if he still is, but at the time of this movie, he was the actual mayor.
Cool. Cool. Yeah.
Uh,
That's cool. And yeah, they mentioned we forgot to mention this, but Cage's character mentions like wanting to run for mayor in
yeah,
the
he
long run,
does.
which is so random, but I guess they kind of tie that in a little like vaguely.
Yeah. So at the 1 hour 18 minute mark, there is our boy Nick dropped the only F-bomb within the movie.
I noticed. Yeah. I noticed immediately. I was like, there it is. There's the PG-13.
uh,
Yeah.
one of the things that I think this movie does, this is my last bit of trivia, but this trivia fact kind of makes me respect the writing in this movie a little bit more.
Sure.
But Dunn tells Santoro that press will begin digging up dirt on him and that he will lose his wife, he will lose his job, his girlfriend, and that he could start thinking about jail, foreshadowing what would happen to Santoro at the end of this movie. So I feel like that kind of thing like is like it's one of those things that like don't ask like you don't have to tell us necessarily like kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not necessary.
Yeah, again, foreshadowing in general is one of those. It's one of those tropes. It's like I always say about twists. Like, just because it's a twist doesn't make the movie or story good or well written. Just because there's foreshadowing doesn't make the movie or story good or well written. It doesn't by itself do that.
And typically foreshadowing at the beginning of the movie like takes place at the beginning. It needs to
Right.
be placed at the earlier portions of this movie. I
Yeah.
think in
Do
some
you?
go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say like when it comes to movies in general, obviously including this one, do you think that editing plays a bigger part in what we see, how we end up feeling about a movie, um, than we really give it credit. I've heard a lot of people really like some people really love the Rent movie, but the ones who hate it really criticize its editing. And then obviously one of the bigger things is the uh, the Justice League film, the original one we got. Like editing was heavily criticized there. So I don't know always I don't always know what to look for and how to distinguish editing from writing, but kind of what are your thoughts on those differences?
I think it depends on the studio. So like Peter Atkins, he is the guy that kind of took over the reins for Clive Barker in terms of Hellraiser. So he did
Mhm.
Hellraiser 2, Hellbound, Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, and then Hellraiser Bloodline. It,
Oh, he took it over immediately.
yeah, so when you watch Hellraiser Bloodline, it takes place over three different periods of time. And a couple years ago, I don't remember the exact publication, but they published his original vision for that film to where the mythology, everything from the mythology, the lore, like everything is fleshed out. And
Mhm.
a lot of that stuff is studios coming in and doing it. So it's always really hard to tell with bigger budget films if it is a studio. Like you mentioned and you brought up like the Justice League versus the Snyder Cut.
Yeah,
You can also look at like the original cut of like BVS. Like when you watch the theatrical cut, it's little edits like here and there because they were trying to essentially tighten the story. When you watch the ultimate cut of that movie, you see that those few seconds completely change the movie altogether. Completely
yeah.
different film. And that's the same thing I think that, is about like that's the Ayer's Snyder cut and also Josh Trank's Fantastic Four. I think a large portion of writing, I think
Which which one was that?
Fantastic Four is the
Yeah, yeah.
2015 one.
So okay, cool.
But I think to answer your question, I think the bigger the studio and the bigger the budget, the more editing is the problem. The smaller the budget and the more independent, then it becomes a writing. And sometimes
Okay.
in the smaller ones, I think that it could definitely 100% can still be um the editing just because, maybe you have like a novice filmmaker, a novice editor that's kind of there. You can't really fault them for that. But I would say nine times out
Right.
of 10, it's going to be the higher the budget, the sloppier the edit. It's going to always be the editing, whereas the lower
Yeah.
the budget, it's going to be a a writing issue.
Do you think that because we get movies all the time. I know Oppenheimer is probably going to be one of these. Movies all the time in the theaters where it's like this movie is ridiculously long. We just had John Wick 4, like ridiculously long for theatrical release. And nobody batted an eye at it at all. People just went and saw it because they wanted to. So do you think that like maybe, and I don't know, I'm just having this out because I'm curious. Do you think that maybe like studios need to retire the concept of the theatrical cut?
Uh, I don't be I do and I don't. So like the whole concept is, let's call for what it is. Marvel changed everything. Marvel changed the way that we look at blockbusters now. And part of that change is the fact that you can now have films that are 3 hours, 3.5 hours. Um, but for a while, the
Did
general,
Lord of the Rings not change that?
not theatrically,
Hmm,
because a lot of the Lord of the Rings that are over that 3 hour threshold are uh extended cuts.
sure.
But the thing I was gonna say is that like the idea is now the idea about from a studio perspective is the reason that you want to try and get away from them is because there are less hours in the day that you can show that movie multiple times, meaning you lose out on potentially millions of dollars. Um, but
Wow.
I also think it now that like you have studios like Oppenheimer is a great example. You brought that up. I think you are kind of getting into it now to where studios are more open to that kind of concept.
Yeah.
Because they know that people don't care, and it just means that
Yeah.
if it's front loaded, and it means it can't play 6 times a day where 2 hour movies can play eight. That just means that they have to extend that to kind of like recoup the budget essentially.
Right. That and or hopefully but and or more movies get IMAX and Dolby releases, which
Mhm.
cost more
Yeah,
per ticket.
yeah. So
Which I honestly like. It bums me out every time. We have one IMAX AMC in the area, and I go to it all the time, despite it being almost 40 minutes away. Um, it's just wonderful. I get bummed out every time I check the schedule, and it's like, cool, I can still only see Little Mermaid in IMAX. It's just like I get that not everybody wants to see like the latest comedy in IMAX, but I would have loved to see Sisu in IMAX. Loved, and it just bums me out that that's not a bigger thing. But anyway,
it's a spectacle thing, man. It's
I guess.
and one of those, speaking of spectacles, that come brings us to the question that we all came here for: is Snake Eyes worthy of high praise? Is it a spectacle?
No, it's not. It's not worthy of praise. There are praiseworthy things about it. Um, but I think for me personally, like, if I'm on Letterbox, which we'll talk about that in a minute. Um, if I'm on Letterboxd and I'm gonna give a movie, if I consider a movie worthy of high praise, I'm giving it at least a 3 stars.
Mhm.
I'm giving it at least above average. That is three stars is 60%. That is above average. Um, and I wouldn't have. This is probably a 2.5 film for me personally, and I don't think it's worthy of high praise.
So I have only ever done this one other time before, but this is a movie that I think goes both ways. I think it is worthy of high praise, and I think it is not worthy of high praise, depending on the mood. I think this is a really great popcorn film that falls apart in the way that popcorn films do. It's really entertaining. It has its funny moments. It's action packed. But I do stand by the fact that this movie has issues. And when you look at other popcorn movies like Transformers, the MCU, all of them have their own fair share of issues. And I think this is a great example of a 90s popcorn film.
Sure,
Um,
cool,
so I am going to say that it really depends on your time. For me personally, this viewing, I think it's slightly worthy of high praise.
sure,
I think it's just kind of nudges in there, but the first time I watched this, I thought this was not worthy of high praise.
sure.
So I'm gonna just say it depends on your mood.
Okay, yeah, that's. I think that's totally, totally fair.
So all right, well let's jump into Letterbox. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, I jumped on the fake social media bandwagon, and I do have Letterboxd. Um, I hope I'm always like only like 3 people follow me, right? Maybe 4 now, I guess. And I'm always like hoping that the people who follow me will notice that like I get in like moods. Like yesterday, it was just 90s movies and not good ones for the most part. Um, that was just the mood that I was in. And a couple weeks ago, it was just LARPing movies. There are multiple LARP related movies. But anyway, yeah. So VH Zest at Letterboxd. Yeah, you should add me. Um, and please, please, please tell me how bad you think my opinions are. It's one of my favorite things. I'm kind of not kidding.
Yeah, I am I really, really love the fact that you're on Letterbox now. It's like one of my I feel like it's one of like my biggest accomplishments as your co-host. I'm just like I've been promoting the like this platform for a year and a half, almost 2 years now,
Yeah.
and finally Micah's like, hey, what that sounds good, I think after we recorded Red Rock West, we ended up like talking about like all answering all of your questions for like a solid like half hour afterwards. It was delightful.
Yeah.
While you guys are there, you guys can also follow me. My name is Captain Nostalgia on Letterbox. You guys can follow us now wherever you guys get your podcasts from. We are on our own feed. Just look up That's High Praise. Wherever you guys get your podcast from, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a cage-filled moment. You guys can also follow our parent company, Victims and Villains. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube as well. And until next time, remember to keep on caging.